I'm going to present you a paper that my friend Moritz Eg and I have written on politics in Germany. So I can't take credit for all of what I say here. It is a joint project. And those of you who are in my methods module will meet Moritz in a few weeks' time, because he's going to present, or we're going to talk about ethnography, which already tells you a little bit about the angle we're coming from. It was an attempt to combine two slightly different perspectives. Me talking more from a political economy perspective, he coming more from sort of cultural studies, ethnography angle. What I want to present you with is a periodization of what we call Merkelism. I'm then going to talk about what we call the exhaustion of Merkelism and symptoms of that exhaustion. And the last part is going to be about causes and possible explanations for what we're seeing. So let's start with the periodization. I did my PhD with Bob Jessup in Lancaster, and Bob always tends to say, when you do a periodization, you need to be clear about doing a periodization of something. So periodization has an object. And in our case, that's Merkelism. See, the question then is raised, what is Merkelism? What we try to do in this article is to build on a theorist and commentator of British politics, Stuart Hall, who wrote about Thatcherism in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And we sort of were drawing upon his work to think about present-day German politics. So what do we say about Merkelism? Well, for us, it is a strategy, and it is a dominant strategy of political crisis management in Germany. Obviously, that's something political, and a certain political style is linked to this. So what we argue is that it is a technocratic, depoliticizing approach, that it comes with sudden U-turns in line with shifts in the public mood, and that it's built on a broad party political consensus. So Merkelism, for us, was very much about managing crisis tendencies in global European and German capitalism, and doing so by basically muddling through, trying to depoliticize issues, turning them into rather technocratic problems that can be solved, and doing so by bringing a lot of different political actors to the table and building a broad consensus. That said, it is not, or does not just concern politics. There is an economic aspect to this project, which we argue is an export-oriented, competitive, corporatist accumulation regime, and it has a certain cultural component as well. Cautious modernization would possibly, and a cautious moderation of certain cultural shifts and changes that are taking place would be a way of viewing Merkelism. Once we have defined this object, we can then turn to a periodization, and our argument is that there are roughly 3 phases in the evolution of Merkelism: a phase of emergence, a phase of consolidation, and a phase of exhaustion. The emergence obviously has to do with Merkel's rise as a leading politician and chancellor of Germany, and with the formation of her first government in 2005. We then enter a sort of high phase of Merkelism, if you will, in 2008, when the global financial and economic crisis hits, and this style of managing these crisis tendencies really comes into its own and enjoys broad support in the political scene, but also in the German population. But what I want to focus on in my talk is the very last phase, which we argue starts from 2015, which is the phase of the exhaustion of Merkelism. Why is it that this chancellor, who was very popular, enjoyed very broad support, was able to get a lot of different party political actors on board with her project? Why is it that suddenly her government seems brittle, her project is under attack, there are constant rumors about when she will resign, she looks very different from the way she looked in this phase when the crisis hit, which we call the phase of consolidation. So, what is the story here when we talk about the exhaustion of Merkelism? Where do we take the concept of exhaustion from? We find it in a book that Stuart Hall has written with some colleagues, which is called Policing the Crisis. And in that book, he has a whole chapter that is dedicated on the exhaustion of consent, which basically talks about how in the 1970s, mid-1970s, in Britain, basically popular consent, so basically the agreement of the population to dominant modes of political decision making is eroding. Back then there was a Labour government that was quite weak, had limited support, and obviously this analysis is about understanding also the rise of Margaret Thatcher and the launch of Thatcherism as a new project. So it's also an exhaustion of what in British politics we call the post-war settlement, the settlement between Labour and capital, that was based on the one hand, union acquiescence, and on the other hand, a welfare state in full employment. So we take that idea and apply it to a different political context and ask, well, can we see a erosion of consensus behind Merkelism? So if we zoom in with our periodization, we can also periodize the exhaustion of Merkelism, and that's what I want to talk about. In our line of argument, we have a situation of polarization in 2015 that is linked to what is called the summer of migration, the fact that hundreds of thousands of refugees arrive in Germany, followed by a period of erosion, which is linked to the events of New Year's Eve 2015, where sexual assault was committed on a mass scale at Cologne Cathedral, which then was the trigger for fierce backlash against Merkel's approach to managing the summer of migration. And the last point is what we would call a stage of agony, which is possibly the end game of that project, which is linked to the 2017 general election. I have limited time, so I'm going to try to do this very quickly. You will all have seen the pictures. You will have read the reports on the summer of migration. Hundreds of thousands of refugees, mostly from the Middle East, entered Germany in 2015. And there was a very complicated situation where the German government decided, under the leadership of Merkel, not to close the German borders and allow those refugees to enter Germany. Why this whole story is important for analyzing Merkelism is that the government became very identified at this point with a pro-refugee position. And no matter what it did later on, there were some sort of fierce crackdowns on refugees. There was a tightening of asylum laws that happened after the event. These things are not much talked about. Merkel is usually identified with the fact that at this point they made the decision not to close the borders, and even got support, and that's what you see here, from a tabloid newspaper like Bild, which is known for often taking anti-refugee, or for having taken anti-refugee, possibly racist views at times. What then happened was that this discourse, where there was, in the beginning, you could argue quite broad popular support for Merkel and her decision to say, well, we allow in those people and we welcome them to Germany. There was a massive shift in discourse after New Year's Eve of 2015. What happened there was that a group of mostly young men, mostly with migrant backgrounds, it's very unclear whether they actually were refugees, and there are serious doubts about whether they entered the country in the summer of migration, sexually assaulted dozens or hundreds of women who were out and about because of the New Year's Eve celebrations. And what you can see here is the media coverage, which you can see is very different. Just look at the images. Here we have welcome culture and this idea of allowing refugees into the country and supporting them. Here we have classical racist tropes and othering. There's a clear-cut difference between black and white. Black is here the color for the perpetrators, white is the color for the victims. So you see here a racist coverage of these events in the imagery. And what's important, it's not just a standard news magazine like Focus, but also Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is a leading liberal newspaper in Germany that uses this imagery. So you see there's a real shift in discourse, and this shift is propelled and exploited by the far right and leads to the rise of the far right also as a party political force. So when we turn to 2017, where the exhaustion of Merkelism in our argument reaches its manifestation point, we see on the one hand political polarization. The alternative for Germany, a far-right political force enters parliament. This is the first time since the 1950s that such a party enters the German parliament. So there is really a strong political support for the far right. And the other thing you see, which is quite striking, is a political fragmentation. So for German standards, all the different parties that enter parliament are fairly close together. It's also the election where the two main parties, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, Christian Democrats obviously being Merkel's party, Social Democrats her current coalition partner, achieved their worst result combined in German history. Which brings me to the question, how can we explain this situation? How can we explain that this very popular chancellor, who enjoyed broad support for her political project, is suddenly unpopular, comes under attack? And I want to look at one factor that wasn't talked much about in the context of the refugee crisis, which is the economic dimension and the economic situation in Germany. In Germany, in recent years, there has been a lot of talk about a jobs miracle. And if you look at the issue, or at the surface level, things look really bright. So if you look at the German labor force, 39 million people were employed in 2005, 44.2 million people in 2017. The unemployment rate halved over the same period. So the talk was, Germany has weathered the economic and financial crisis incredibly well. The labor market is performing strongly, people are in jobs. If we dig a little deeper, the picture becomes more complicated. What you have here is the work volume of the labor force. So the total numbers of hours worked of all the workers in Germany. When you look at those numbers, you see that they're very stable over the same time period. What does this tell us? Well, if the number of people working has gone up considerably, this means that more people are working fewer hours. And if we then look at wage development, this tells you already that there is a problem. What you see here is the development of real wages in Germany divided by three groups. The first group is high income earners. The second group is this is GDP. This is high income earners. This is median income earners, and this is low income earners. And what you see is that high income earners basically enjoy increasing wages, that for middling income earners in this last phase it's fairly stable and stagnant, and that for low income earners you have a drop in real wages. So there's a real class dimension, if you will, in terms of real wage development. And so behind the story of the jobs miracle, there is a different story, which is a lot of people are under pressure economically. They work few hours, they're often badly paid, and they're losing out. So to come to the question of causes, our argument is that there is a silent discontent with the socioeconomic situation in Germany, and there is an absence of a language for this kind of situation. The general narrative is Germany is a success story. We are enjoying a jobs miracle. The German economy is doing well. So there's a real absence of ways in which we can describe this situation. This also means that discontent produces a narrowing social base for the existing political project. So we call this a breeding ground for nationalism and racism. Now what's important in this type of analysis is that this in itself is not a economic problem, this is why there's racism. But it creates a situation where then if you add in conjunctural factors, events, in particular the fact that the government became identified with a pro-refugee position, that creates opportunities for far-right political interventions. And in our view, this is how we can explain why there is a rise of the far right, why there is a political and cultural polarization in Germany and a party political fragmentation. So, to conclude, we argue that Merkelism as the dominant mode of political crisis management became exhausted in the last few years, and that we have to take into account both the sort of long-term economic developments and more specific political cultural factors that have to do with the events that played out in recent years. And I thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So we move from all of Germany to a part of Germany, and some of you who have just arrived in Germany, I thought it would be helpful. We talk about here the border was between East and West, and these are the new German states that joined all of Germany in 1990, almost 30 years ago. And there are now 5 of them plus Berlin. And here is the face of the right wing, a very friendly looking guy, but one has also identified him in a group of neo-Nazis. And neo-Nazis are not always coming with tattoos on their face, sometimes they come also in friendly ways. And he is the leader of the party in Thüringen, which is next door, the state, and the state where we had the most recent elections. The key message is that it is not just economics, that there are other forces that lead to the success of such a group. And I will first tell you a little bit about that group in East Germany, and then I give some explanations. I go through them step by step. So what we see here is a bit strange because it starts on the right side, 2015, and goes to 2019 here. I'm not quite sure why that's the case, it's unusual. But when you see that, it is in Hamburg rather little, but then in Saxony already a lot. And so there is an East-West divide. The Aktion für Deutschland is more successful in East Germany, and here were the last results in Saxony and Thüringen, the East German states. There. Now, where do they get their voters from? And here we have the ones who voted in 2014 in our neighboring state, the different ones, and here they voted just a few weeks ago. And that is the non-voters. So they can mobilize people who have withdrawn from voting there. And they can mobilize them. But they of course get support from all kinds of groups, not so much from those who have voted for the Green Party. Educationally, in 2016, so that was a few years ago, overall it is people very much in the middle of Germany, you know, in terms of education, who have a solid education but not a university. University would then be, no, even that secondary. So it is really in the middle, people who have this kind of solid education. The income groups, you also see, there are quite some well-to-do people. And here I allow myself a little comment on Alex. You forgot about one key group, and that is those who live off their interests. And the financial crisis led to a situation where people who have then saved money, and that's the German upper middle class, that they are no longer getting any return unless they invested into housing or go speculating into stocks. And after the financial crisis, a lot of those middle class people, of course, didn't want to go into stocks. That's very risky. And not everyone has the ambition to get through the whole process of buying real estate. So many of them are quite unhappy. And that's important because the key opening for this group, the Aktion für Deutschland, the right-wing group, were economists criticizing the euro and criticizing the situation that there is so little interest and that there might be inflation in the future. They have been driven out of the party, but they were at the beginning, and that is also very important that they are part of that party, the people who are well educated. What is very shocking for social democracy is that in this last election, the workers voted for the Aktion für Deutschland. And also quite interesting, a huge difference between men and women. Men are much more prone to support this new right-wing party. And here we have a survey of how people think about the world, and the survey had all kinds of questions, and I only read the question concerning trying to find out whether people are racist or not. And if demand for labor declines, foreigners should be sent back to their respective homelands. And that in a way stands for those who think the survey for racism. And you see that the ones voting for the right-wing party, of course, are supporting this kind of a statement by a high number. But anti-Semitism is also quite strong, and Jews are basically not present in East Germany, but nevertheless, they seem to be a problem for people, though they're not there. And so it goes. It shows you that these right-wing ideas are really then finding their party. Now trying to explain that, and so I go back to the division. Germany was at the front of the Cold War. Here, 20 kilometers away was the border. And the French, the British, and especially the Americans were present in West Germany, and the Soviet Union was present in East Germany there. And the communists were, of course, the key opponent to Nazism, but not all of the Nazis were brought from East Germany to West Germany. So there were also lots of Nazis left, and there was a denial then by the communists. The communists had taken over the government, and they didn't really want to talk about it anymore. They were saying, now we are free of Nazis. Of course, the Nazis didn't have power, but of course, ideas of Nazism were still around. Very interestingly, there was no fraternization between the Russian soldiers and the Germans. So there was a lot of friendship talk, but there was no fraternization. There was in the beginning also not much fraternization between American soldiers and Germans in West Germany, but over time that had changed. But that didn't change in East Germany. And then West Germany got into full employment at the end of the 50s, and then invited people from Turkey, Italy, Greece, and so on to come to Germany. And in the GDR, it started later. It started more in the 70s, late 70s, and people from Mozambique and other places, Vietnam, especially Vietnam, who came as contract workers, completely separated. In the factory, they were in a different department. The political people didn't want any mingling. Interesting stories. Of course, Soviet politics were not known to be very democratic, and also they read a lot on Marx and so on, but they read very little on the critique of authoritarianism that came from neo-Marxists and people close to that, for example, in Frankfurt. And that is a bit my own experience of having been in East Germany at the time of unification as someone trying to build a group of industrial policy experts and labor people. That overall it was a rather equal society, and even the head of state, Honecker, he was living in the house like a German normal physician, doctor, but kind of from the material stuff, it was not much more. And the normal people were not very different. There were, of course, certain differences, and as they were not so visible, so different, the small differences were very visible for the people. They're very interesting. And that then someone coming from Mozambique had a leather jacket was a discussion that he might then, because for them, buying things was always a bit problematic. You know, getting consumer goods that were not standardized, like an extra leather jacket, was difficult. So if someone then had such a leather jacket, it was a discussion. That this person, of course, was separated from his family and was suddenly no longer in warm weather but in the cold weather and so on, and then might have the right to have a nice leather jacket. That was not discussed. So looking really for these kind of differences isn't part of that story. Now the shadow of reunification. Here, the reunification started with a protest against the East German government, saying, you are the government and we are the people, and you are not listening to us. You're not really democratic. And then it slowly shifted to, we are one people, meaning we are Germans, like the West Germans then. And so the appeal of unification was on national terms. So, and that's, I think, a rather important story. It's also very important for Eastern Europe, because they wanted to get rid of the Soviets from Moscow, and they didn't want suddenly new Berlin or Brussels to tell them what to do. So the national sovereignty drive very strong. The disorientation, now here a lot of people who come here knew, you have to imagine as an East German, you live there, you the same housing and so on, but everything changes. Everything, the way the kids go to school, the way you go with your money, everything, the jobs, everything changes there. And that is a disorientation. Half the jobs are gone, especially industrial jobs. And in a way, as you are disoriented, you seem to be dumb, you know, for the dominant group, you seem to be dumb. And here we have to go back perhaps to my first slide with the map. All of East Germany, the population, is as much as one of our major states in West Germany. So the masses of people were, of course, West Germans and not East Germans. So in this situation then, lots of them felt as second-class people. And also as West Germans went in and could reclaim houses and so on. So there was also then people being thrown out of their houses because West Germans were able to reclaim them. Important ideological void. Socialism was gone there. What should fill in there? And all of these youth organizations, communist youth organizations, were closed down. And so the youth didn't really have any groups. The churches moved in a little bit, but very much also the right-wing groups from West Germany moved in, very strategically then. And Alex already mentioned that. Here we have now it is more normal. Here's the 60s and the 2000s. Here in the late 60s we had already a bit of a rise of a right-wing party in West Germany. And we had also in Hamburg then, after unification, we had already also very suddenly won, but they never gained really strength for a long haul. It was really more a sudden protest, and now we have this new situation of a long haul. What I wanted to tell you that there were, of course, right-wing groups, well-organized right-wing groups in West Germany. They moved into East Germany and they found support. And what happened rather briefly after unification, that houses where people seeking asylum were burned in two places, Hoyerswerda and in Rostock-Lichtenhagen. Now, role of emigration, and 3.7 million people, that is about a quarter of the people of East Germany left East Germany. Over time, some people returned, East Germans returned, but also West Germans going into East Germany. But a huge shift internally in a rather small country there. And especially the young, and a lot of females, were educated females there. And there was this kind of a difference in West Germany. In the 50s and 60s, the ideal was that the women should stay home. My mother had to fight very hard to return to the labor market. And in East Germany, it was taken for granted that women work. And so these women in East Germany were then looking for work in West Germany. And that then also changed the balance, gender balance, in East Germany, and may also explain to a certain extent that the men are more prone to vote for the right wing. And that has been now also researched, that those now left behind are more skeptical toward new people. Interesting, they would actually need new people. Their property prices would go up, their houses would get more value, you know. But as they are somehow left behind, they are more skeptical. And that explains also a little bit this anti-Semitism where there are no Jews. Here, not so well seen, but you see right at the opening of the border, a huge out-migration from East Germany. And it's only now, in 2018, that it is balanced, that people move out and in at the same level. Here, before the wall, the famous wall, Berlin Wall, but the wall was also here, 20 kilometers away. Before that, there was also out-migration. It came to a sudden stop because of the wall. You got shot. Interesting statistics here is the percentage of the right-wing votes there on that scale, and on that scale, how many people have left there. And the more people have left, the more the right wing gets votes. So that also shows you that those left behind are more willing to vote for the right wing.